Hey everyone, we're gonna wait just a few more minutes before we get started. So we'll probably get started at 3 or 4 minutes past the hour. All right, let's go ahead and get started. So welcome to the 22.1 office hour session. We're all really excited to be talking about our latest release. And I'm joined here today by Michael and Chris, who are two great participants, and I'm gonna let them do a round of intros so everyone is familiar. So Michael, do you wanna just give a quick intro of who you are and what you do at Cockroach?
Sure. So my name is Michael. I'm a group product manager here, and I oversee the DB platform areas on our product, which cover a lot of sort of the operator fundamentals and the deep innards, let's say, of the database itself.
Yeah, there's a lot under your area. All right, and then we can move over to Chris.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Chris Casano. I'm a solution engineering manager here in the eastern part of the US. What that means, I essentially help customers with Cockroach, understanding your use cases, what you're trying to do, what you're trying to solve for, and make sure that you're successful with them. Great to meet you.
Cool, yeah, and as you can see, Chris is in the New York office. I'm also zooming in today from the New York office, so it's exciting that we're all back in person. And my name's Megan. I'm on the product marketing team, and I work very closely with the whole product team and work on our launches. So we released our latest version, CockroachDB 22.1, a few weeks ago. And today we're going to be talking through the updates. So we'll give a brief overview of what's new, why we prioritize certain updates, why customers were asking for things, and why these updates are valuable for you all. And then we're going to turn it over to questions. So this is really your chance to ask any questions you have about the release and how things work or how you should be thinking about the updates. And then there's this great opportunity to win this limited edition t-shirt. So we made this just for this release. It says, "Scale is always in style," which is my favorite tagline for a t-shirt. And we're going to be, for those of you who do ask questions, we're going to enter your names into a raffle and pick 3 winners. So I think we're only making about 50 of these t-shirts. So they're super limited edition, and I want one for sure. Okay, cool. So we will be answering questions when we get to the Q&A session. If things do come up while we're kind of presenting about what's new, we'll just make a note of the question and we'll get to it once we do get to that section. All right. So let's jump in. So in this release, the real focus of this release was updates to help you with your application journey, no matter where you are in that journey. So the tagline is this: build your way from prototype to super scale, which really means that we've delivered improvements in CockroachDB, whether you're just getting started and you want to start quickly and begin prototyping, or you're in the phase of your application where you're trying to optimize performance and manage that application in production, or whether you've reached, reached scale and need to deliver peak performance everywhere, handle millions of transactions per second. So really updates across the full application journey to help you build and operate more smoothly. And the first bucket of updates in CockroachDB is all around getting started more quickly. How do you stand up CockroachDB? How do you integrate it with the various different tools in your stack, and do this in a more seamless fashion? So we have a bunch of updates that we're super excited about. The first one here is this new CLI for CockroachDB dedicated and serverless. This is one of the big ones that I know everyone internally and our customers have been expressing a lot of excitement about. So Michael, do you want to just give a quick overview of what this is and why we're excited?
Yeah, so the idea of the idea again is to get you up and running quickly with Cockroach. And so we created CLI, an interactive interface that allows you to sort of, you can download the C Cloud binary. It's available in Homebrew as well. And just very quickly, especially with C Cloud Quick Start, get connected to a database, create a cluster for free. What it will do is it'll create a cluster and connect you to a CockroachDB serverless cluster. And then within minutes, if not seconds, you're up and running and connected to a database. And the idea here is to really make it easy for you, to remove the barriers for you to get trying as quickly as possible. And along that same theme of starting faster and begin prototyping, a large part of that is integrating with the tools that you know and love. And in the latest Slash data survey that came out, developer survey that just came out, Prisma was the #1 ORM for JavaScript applications. And so CockroachDB now has full support for Prisma as well. And so if you're a Node or TypeScript developer and you use Prisma, now you can use that natively with CockroachDB as well. And this exists on all sides of integrations. Change data capture and sort of applications where you're sending data to other services, or your BI tool or data lake are increasingly popular. And Google Cloud PubSub is one of the ones that we got the most questions about. Beta support for being able to send data via our change data capture functionality to Google Cloud PubSub is now available in the 22.1 release. And then I saw a question about row level TTL, so I'll talk a little bit more in depth about that one than the others. So we've now introduced the ability for you to define a table to be subject to an automated row level time to live. And so at a high level, what the functionality does is when you set or alter a table to be TTL, you set Cockroach does is we create a, by default, not visible column called CRDB internal expiration. And that's checking timestamp Z formatted date that is either set when you insert that data or when you run an update command against that row. And you are setting, what you do is you set the rule for how long that data should live before a background process that is effectively, let's call it a job, and it runs on an hourly schedule. So every hour by default, the TTL job will be spin up to look for any rows within that table that you've set the TTL for, to then run under the hood, which is actually a batch SQL delete. And so it'll show up in the same way, for example, or rather, it will run an actual SQL command under the hood. It'll batch up the rows that you want to delete, and it'll go through each of those batches and run SQL commands against it to delete the data. So in the similar way, it is an MBCC compliant delete because it's running through all of our SQL instrumentation under the hood.
Cool, yeah.
But this was one of our most requested features. I think before, people would have to figure out the right batch size, or people have to, create their own cron jobs to do this. And it's become increasingly popular in databases as well. And so we figured that it would be a really important utility, given how much we heard feedback that this is something that customers really wanted.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. I think it was a feature that's been requested since 2017, and it was just one of the top features. And so it's super exciting that we've delivered that now. All right, I do see a bunch of questions coming in. We'll get to those. We'll come back and get to those when we enter the Q&A session. So the second bucket of updates we have are all around optimizing CockroachDB more efficiently, easier management, easier troubleshooting and monitoring. So Chris, do you want to just quickly cover, what is the management API that we released and why that's also one of the features that people are quite excited about?
Yeah, I would say the management API is probably it's probably my top feature that I'm most excited about in this release. So we've had this request from several different customers over the years. I would say ever since our dedicated service went live. And the idea is to be able to manage the cluster just like you would through the UI. So anything that you could do in a UI, you can essentially do through the API, because customers like automation. They like being able to use ways to maintain the cluster through automation they might have. So you'll see within the API, there's a lot of goodness there as far as being able to create clusters, create users, edit the clusters. You have a lot of control over, just managing the environment, which is rather nice. So really neat that came out, and there's going to be a lot more that's coming there in the future. So definitely take a look at it. The docs are really well laid out too. So if you want to understand, hey, what does the request need to be when I want to, submit a particular change, and what do you get as a response? It's all really well documented. And the other big one that's come across over the years too is being able to externalize the observability from Cockroach, because what I've always heard from customers is that they want to overlay their observability with other parts of their stack, right? Their application logs and so forth. They want to be able to go into one place where they can see it all, as opposed to going into different systems to look at observability in different silos. So the Datadog integration has been probably the most requested platform to use for looking at metrics. So there's some new dashboards that we've created here as well that will allow you to basically just put an API key into your Cockroach Cloud dedicated environment, and then it will ship all over the metrics into Datadog for you. And we have some pre-built dashboards that you can utilize as well. So great new integration, really easy to set up and get moving on as well.
Awesome. And then also in this theme, we do have a bunch of updates that are related to finding and fixing really common performance issues in CockroachDB. So do you want to give some color around those updates?
Yeah, almost forgot about that piece. So yeah, there's also a lot of good SQL goodness. So if you spend time going through and optimizing SQL queries, if you use the console UI, there's a whole bunch of great things there around explain plans and being able to pull down statement bundles. There's a lot of new things there around looking at contention and showing you how to optimize your queries. We also keep now a history of explain plans as they change, so you can see a history of how a query can change over time. And there's even a new feature around giving you ideas of how to even optimize your query, right? If you're not using a particular index and your query can benefit from having an index, we'll give you some insight into, hey, maybe you should create an index here for your query. So a lot more good things coming out of how to optimize SQL queries. There's also a new hot ranges report that's great as well, that lets you know, hey, these are the hot ranges in the cluster. Before, we had kind of a debug page that would show you, hey, these are the hot ranges, which was all in JSON, and you can, it was helpful, but it wasn't as consumable as the new dashboard page that's out there now. So yeah, a lot of good stuff that's out in the console.
Yeah, for sure. I know that team has been turning out a lot of updates over the past few months, so it's awesome. And just finishing up here on the last bucket of updates. So I think everyone on this call is familiar with CockroachDB and how CockroachDB really eases scale. So in this release, we have released a variety of updates that really take our handling of scale to the next level. So they fall into kind of two sections. The first, all around, how do you operate at geographic scale when you have to handle data regulations and data domiciling restrictions. The second bucket is really about how CockroachDB handles a ton of transactions and scales to handle a lot of transactions. So, Chris, I think that you are familiar with a lot of these updates around the data domiciling updates. So you want to just give some context there?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you've been following some of the releases that Cockroach has had, so we've added multi-region syntax about a year ago, and the syntax makes it really easy to set up, databases, tables, and even rows as far as how you want to position data across multiple regions within the cluster. We used to have primitives that you'd have to use to kind of set this up that were kind of really detailed and nebulous at times as far as setting up, but the new abstractions made this really easy. So on top of that abstractions, we've added this new thing called super regions. So in times in Cockroach, you can have multiple regions that you utilize within your cluster. And as you do have an availability zone failure or a region failure, Cockroach handles that magically for you. But there are definitely times where you want to keep things within a specific region, right? So maybe you have 7 regions across the world. But if you do have a regional failure, you want to keep that data within the immediate region. So we added these new things called super regions that can help you kind of give you a higher order of where you want to keep data localized for, it could be for compliance purposes, but also for, just keeping data that's close to your users or services as being as close as possible. That way, when you're doing if you do have a region failure, you're not failing to the other end of the world. You can kind of keep things localized to where your users and services are. That's the basics of it, I would say.
We can get into more detail if people have questions, for sure. I think super regions is my favorite name of a feature that's out there. It just sounds like Superman. All right, and then we'll finish up on an overview of how we've kind of optimize CockroachDB to handle transactions at an even better way than even before. So Michael, do you want to just dive into some of those updates?
Sure. I think one of the things to remember, right, is CockroachDB is meant to be resilient and horizontally scalable. And one of the benefits is if you know beforehand that you're going to have heavy load, you can start to horizontally scale, add more compute to your cluster and be able to do that. But that's not always the case. Sometimes that load comes unforeseen circumstances. I'm sure everybody has had a data scientist that somehow got former data scientist here, so I think I can make fun of myself, but access to the production cluster and run huge amounts of OLAP queries or just select star from biggest table. And those are the things you can't predict. And so we've added more protections into the database to allow you to be able to better survive those, but more importantly, react to it. And so firstly, prioritizing the requests at the query level. You can set, for example, your applications to different priority levels. And we then will use the emission control logic that we've added to, if your node or your cluster is in an overloaded state, to admit the higher priority ones, such that if somebody comes in, does submit something that's a large query, hopefully it's a lower priority or normal priority, or you've set your application to be high priority, such that when somebody is running that your application has a lot less impact if it does get overloaded. And it gives you time as an operator to react to that change, either to add nodes, to cancel that query, and to otherwise sort of react to it in a way with very little impact to your end users and your core application's user experience. If indeed something like that is very sort of, let's call it pervasive, or sort of the overload is something that's become really hard to diagnose. Chris alluded to it before, and the idea of this hot ranges page allows you to see which of the ranges within your cluster are the ones that are really hot, and then you can begin to unpack which table or which index is that, which queries are hitting that index. How can I then either cancel that query, block that query, work with the customer, split the range? There's a number of things you can do. But step number one is understanding what part you need to fix. And we've made that a lot easier. Like Chris said, previously you had to parse or grep this huge JSON object. We've made it a lot more a lot easier for you. You can see Chris smiling because he secretly loves this feature as well. But it really is all about making your life as an operator easier. When something that is overloading, now you can lessen that impact and give you time to react. Well, what do I need to react to? Give you the right visibility into what you need to react to so that you can take quick prescribed actions and get you out of that bad situation more easily.
All right, thank you. So we're gonna go over to the Q&A section now, and I've seen a lot of great questions coming in, so we'll just start, we'll start going through them. Actually, I did wanna just answer one of the questions that's closer to the bottom about which offerings are these features available in? So the question was, are these SQL improvements available in self-hosted or just dedicated in serverless? So that's a great question. Unless we're specifying specifically, so I think for the API and CLI and for the Datadog integration, we are specifically specifying that the updates are for dedicated and serverless. Unless we're saying that, the updates are available across all the offerings with a few caveats, given that serverless is still in beta. So for example, there's no multi-region capabilities in serverless right now because it's in beta. So the super regions aren't available. But for the most part, generally, all the updates are available across all three offerings. All right, so I think we should, do you guys want to just go back to the top and just start going through? All right, so I'm gonna, hold on. Here we go. I'm going to go back to this first slide here, and we'll just start at the top. So there is a question about, can you discuss cursors in v22.1? Is this something that either of you want to address?
So I could kind of talk through this one. So with the cursors, so if you're looking at this from the perspective, so for cursors, as I understand it from a SQL perspective, like that's something that's not supported today, right? So think of that as, you use kind of cursors in like stored procedures or something like that to iterate through rows. That's something that's not in the database today. Something we are thinking about, but I don't think there's a timeline to when that would possibly happen. And then I know there's times within like if you're creating a Java app and you want to use the Postgres wire protocol cursors for implicit transactions, I think we have docs on that. I'm not sure if that's what the question's around or if it's on like the traditional SQL cursors. Cursors is an interesting name. Even in change feeds, we have a concept called cursors too. So I'm not sure, Samir, if I'm answering your question, but if you can come back with another question that's a little bit more specific, hopefully we can answer it for you.
Thanks,
I don't know, Michael, if there's anything you want to add to that.
No, that's about right. I think one of the things we are aware of is that certain ORMs rely on cursors for some of their functionality. And so that's something we're aware of and looking to work through to make sure that the tools, again, that you know and love are compatible with Cockroach. Cool.
There were a few questions that came in about TTL. I know, Michael, you went into some detail there, but do you want to give a little bit more color? Yeah. Sure.
I'll just knock through them. Hopefully, Summer, I was able to go deep enough for what you wanted. I think to your question, John, about can you set the TTL to not just row level, but table level? I think it is a table level setting, and all of the rows within that table have the same expiration, if that makes sense. Insofar as you can set the rows in this table to expire in 3 hours, and then anytime that hourly, let's call it a cron job for now, runs, you can see it'll find any rows where that CRDB internal expiration date is more than 3 hours old, and then it will batch those into those delete queries. So it is row level TTL insofar as like we're not deleting the table, we're deleting the row, but it is a table level setting, if that makes sense. And then in terms of immediate TTL, I want to clear out space in the database and reflect that immediately. I don't know if there's a sort of a lower bound on what you can set the expiration to. You would probably want to set both the expiration and the rate at which that polling or cron job happens as well. But I would think that that's something you'd want to test first in terms of the performance, right? Because if you have something that's polling every second, that's spinning up a Go routines, it's going to hit your CPU. So I think it'd be something that I would guess is not sort of desirable, but I am curious if you're willing to sort of pop it in the chat, what your use case for that might be, because I can jump to the next one, which is how we deal with tombstones. Because it's a SQL delete, and we're multi-version concurrency control, MVCC, it's not wiped from disk immediately. We do have a separate process that is similarly running on sort of a sort of looping polling, which is looking for MVCC tombstones that are older than the GC window. By default today, that's 24 hours, but some people can increase that, some people can lower that. But once that MVCC tombstone is beyond some time, we also have a GC job. And when I'm saying job, there's actually a sort of an infrastructure construct within CockroachDB that is jobs, and you can see those jobs in the jobs page within your DB console UI, or via running the show jobs command in SQL. But it does spin up a job to garbage collect sort of if you like drop a table and it like sets all those to be an MVCC tombstone. Otherwise, sort of the GC job that's currently running will just find those MVCC tombstones and clean them up when that job runs, it sees that tombstone is beyond the garbage collection expiration time. Immediate delete. I think if you want to clear up space, your best shot is to lower the garbage collection time on that table or database that you want to clear data from, and then run the SQL delete. I think the TTL is really meant for you to not have to think about it, and it rotates through over the time, but you shouldn't be using it for sort of like a manual one-off operation. Feel free to just run a SQL delete on that case. And there are some best practices that we have in our docs around the best way to run a SQL delete, because the thing to note about a SQL delete, that's a transaction, right? And the more ranges you have to touch, the more rows you have to delete, the longer that transaction is, the more longer you hold that transaction open, the longer you're likely to hit contention. And so there are some best practices in our docs about how to sort of batch delete rows in a way that trades off speed versus reducing transaction contention.
And there was also a question in the chat from Hassam about, can you alter an existing table to be TTL enabled?
You can. I just put the docs in the chat as well. So there is an alter command that you can use if you needed to change the the time window or something.
Yeah, and the thing to note is when you're adding the TTL functionality to a table that doesn't already exist, it will run a schema change, because that CRDB internal expiration column is not a virtual column. It's actually stored on disk for the reason that we want it to be durable, right? Durability with a distributed database is a whole other concept to think about, because anything can fail at any given time. And so I wouldn't say it's a rule per se, but it's definitely a strong guideline that anything you want to be durable needs to be stored to disk. You can have things in memory, you can store things in a cache, but there always should be a source of truth. And so for a table that previously did not have row level TTL sort of set to it, you will need to sort of, when you run the alter command under the hood, it will run a schema change first to backfill all of the sort of values for the CRDB internal expiration column, such that then now TTL can be used.
Perfect. And we had another question in the beginning from Samir on when will ldap be supported?
You want me to take this one?
Go for it.
Sure.
So yeah, this question comes up a lot, usually for self-hosted deployments. I would say, there's pieces on our self-hosted deployments which kind of allow you to connect through ldap if you go in the Kerberos route, but we don't have too many customers doing that today. If you look how the security landscape has been changing around using identity providers, there are things that we support that I would say go a bit beyond some of the older capabilities around ldap. So being able to use identity providers such as OIDC providers and so forth are all on our roadmap. In this release, we do have support for our Cockroach Cloud dedicated option to use both Google Auth as well as Microsoft as identity providers. GitHub was already there, but that's a big piece as far as being able to support or modernize into new security authentication architectures. So that's been our direction. There are pieces in self-hosted that allow you to do somewhat similar, like the database console. You can connect that through an identity provider as well if you wanted to, which I believe is in our docs. But that's kind of our direction as far as where we're heading down on the identity provider side, if that's helpful. Michael, I don't know if there's anything you want to add to it, but. Yeah,
not too much to add to that. It's generally the direction we're going in, but I think timing TBD.
Thanks. And we'll move on to the next one. So a question from Saurabh on how is CockroachDB integrated with public cloud vendors? Not exactly sure. Maybe you can provide a little more context on your question there, but CockroachDB dedicated and serverless do run on either Google Cloud or on Amazon. I know we're planning to add support for Azure in the future. Anything, Chris or Michael, you want to add around that? I think, yeah.
Yeah, I would say we integrate with the cloud providers really well. There's a lot of different features to Cockroach, and some of them have features to specific things that are specific to cloud providers. So for example, we have something called change data capture that allows you to send data to cloud storage, whether that be in Google, Azure, Amazon S3, that's all supported, well integrated. There's also times where you want to use data that's in those storage providers to import it into Cockroach. So that's supported as well. As Megan mentioned, we're very integrated on our managed offering, or our dedicated, what we call our dedicated offering, that works within AWS and GCP. We also just in this release had also change data capture supporting Google PubSub, which is a nice new feature that a lot of customers have been asking for. So again, that's being able to take data that's been changed in the database and send it off to Google PubSub. What else? I'm sure there's more I'm missing. I mentioned the identity providers in like 2 questions ago. I'm sure there's other things I'm missing. Oh, even with backups, that's another good one. So you can, if you're interested in encrypting some of the backups on your own, if you're self-hosting a deployment in the cloud, you can use the cloud provider KMSs to encrypt the backups as well. So that's another piece of integration. So there's like a whole bunch of these little things that are out there in the docs and so forth that just let you know that we're well integrated into cloud provider architectures.
Awesome, thanks, Chris. So there's also a question about whether we can create more training videos around the features in 22.1, maybe under Cockroach University. So we actually do have a lot of great tutorials that are available and are also going to be published in the next few weeks. So I know we have one on the API, one on the CLI. I believe Abby, who's on your team, Michael, just made a video about how to integrate with Google PubSub and a tutorial for that. So these are actually available on our YouTube, just easily accessible for anyone. We also often will tweet out the videos when we publish them, so just keep an eye out there. And all right, we're gonna move on to, there's some questions about super regions. So let's move over to that section. From Karsten, there was a question that asked, can a single database be split between regions, or is it one database per one region? Do you want to answer that?
Sure. So you can have a database in one region, or you can have it span across multiple regions. That's the kind of the beauty of the syntax. You can kind of choose how you want to deploy it. Naturally, what Cockroach wants to do by default in a multi-region environment is be able to spread your data out across all the regions for maximum survivability. But you can choose how you want your survival goals. You can choose, hey, I only want to survive an AZ failure, and it'll keep more of the replicas within a region so that you'll have faster writes. You might not have the highest survival goal there, but you have that flexibility in how you want to deploy. Again, if you want to survive multiple, or survive regional failures, then the data will get spread out across the region. So you have maximum survivability, but you might have a little bit of write latency since you have to go to another region to get a consensus write. So yeah, you can kind of choose how you want to do this. What's really nice about Cockroach is that you don't have to go through a single primary writer to do these things. You can kind of pick and choose, hey, this database primary locality is in US East. I have another database that's where that primary can be in EU Central. You have a total flexibility as far as how you want to deploy these multi-regions environments, and you don't have to think about write masters. You can just think about where your database needs to be. Your database table or rows need to be localized for the maximum performance and maximum survivability.
And I think just to add to that, the sort of functional, I don't want to say rule of thumb, but sort of like principle under the hood is data placement decisions are done at the range level, right? And so you can specify placement of the data down to that level. And under the hood, when you're setting a database to say, be a multi-region database, it is actually moving the actual data itself under the hood on each of those data movement distribution decisions is checking for those rules and then conforming to those rules under the hood.
All right, let's move on to, there's a question about monitoring and permissions. So does the 22.1 monitoring allow the application owner, not the admin, to dig deeper into their performance issues without having a higher level of permission?
Yeah, so I could take that really quickly. I think we are beginning to add more granular roles and permissions. My understanding is that one of the ones we added recently is a sort of monitoring only permission that you can add a role to be able to log into the DB console without necessarily giving them SQL access, but you can layer those roles on top of each other. You can layer those permissions into a role that you could create. What we don't have today is this notion of I can only see the data from my application. That can get tricky, especially if multiple applications are touching the same database and whatnot. But we are starting to add more granular roles around monitoring. And if what we've added in 22.1 doesn't meet your needs, that is something that we're always willing to take feedback on. And in fact, us adding this monitoring only permission was a customer is actually requesting and saying, hey, oftentimes the people who are operating our database, we don't want to give them SQL access. We just want to give them monitoring access. A lot of companies we work with, for example, have production management teams that need access to those monitoring tools only. And so that's something that we're constantly looking for feedback on so that we can make sure improvements there. But in terms of application level, not yet, but sort of monitoring specific permissions, that's something we're starting to unpack and unravel starting in 22.1.
Just to add to that, the roles you might want to look up for this is the view activity role or view activity redacted role, which will basically allow a user to get more, some of those monitoring things that you might want them to have.
Yep, and I think, Michael, that's a really good point. That a lot of these features we're releasing are coming from people requesting them or like running into pain points, and then we're solving the pain points. So definitely, if you have features that you want to see or requests or just want to talk about something, definitely contact us. All right, another question from Karsten. So is there a timeout for the queries being throttled due to low quality of service?
Yeah, so there are no timeouts. I think there's something that we assume and see sort of as best practice is you have application or client side timeouts. And if something is truly sort of queued for too long, that it'll hit those application timeouts instead. The one thing I will say is that it's not an infinite queue. So it's a combination of no timeouts with the assumption that there's a client side timeout. But in addition to that, there's the notion that the queue has a max size. And so we won't just keep emitting things into that queue. And then it'll return an error to the SQL client. I don't know the exact error code or SQL state off the top of my head, but between the combination of client side timeouts and a max queue, that's a way for that's the signal for you to monitor on those and then look and see, hey, is there something more nefarious here, or is there something that I need to take action on at this moment?
Cool. So we're going to talk. We can talk about the new CDC features. So I don't think we specifically covered them in our overview, but there are a bunch of new features. And Alan had a question about how they could possibly be used to replicate changes between two clusters.
Yeah, so the CDC feature itself is not new. We've added a lot of functionality on top of it. The answer I would say here is that change data capture was built to allow you to send logical data changes to an external system. I think the intention for why it was built was not replication between the two clusters, in large part because the notion of replication is built into Cockroach. The notion of regional resilience is built into Cockroach. So it's quite frankly a piece of functionality that folks haven't requested as much as they would say if we were a single region, single instance database. And so the short answer is that we haven't added any functionality to make sort of this logical replication sort of achievable or / any easier. There's nothing stopping someone from creating sort of, I don't know if you want to call it a wrapper around the change feed to sort of ingest that into another database, but that's not something that we natively support today.
All right, and then there was also a question about backups. So did we make any updates related to backups in this release?
I can talk to some of them. So a lot of the improvements to backup that we made this go around were small UX tweaks and major improvements under the hood. So at a very high level, for example, we've lowered the memory footprint for backup, right? And that's always good. That's always a good thing in terms of performance, especially if you're backing up a lot of data and backing up often. Lowering that memory footprint has a big difference. We've also made some other changes to backup. For example, you can now rotate the encryption key that's used to encrypt your backups if you say have key rotation rules enforced by your security team. Or we've also added native support for GCP's key management system, key management store. I don't know what they call it on GCP actually, to sort of, instead of putting in a passcode that you use to encrypt your backups, you instead can make a call to the KMS, and all of that is sort of encrypted over the wire. The key is sort of only stored in memory and then flushed when the backup thing is done. So it's never, the key's never committed to any sort of disk or hardened anywhere. So we've made a number of UX improvements around it like that. But I think in terms of performance and sort of streamlining the impact under the hood, lowering the memory footprint was a big point of investment this go around. And in the next release in 22.2, we're continuing to lower that memory footprint as well.
Thanks, Michael. So we have one more question in the Q&A. If you do have anything else you want to ask, drop it in there in the next few minutes. So the question is from Samir, and it is, are there any updates related to resource management in 22.1? So CPU, IO.
Yeah, I'm not, so I think
This goes back to admission control, right?
Yeah, so it's not explicitly about resource management, but rather protecting against overload of those resources. I don't think we have, or the notion of reserving CPU for an application, for example, those are not things that we've added to 22.1. The primary thing we've done in terms of resource management is starting with overload protection to start, and that's the quality of service and the admission control aspects that we talked about earlier.
All right, we just got one more. This will be our last question that we can get to. So it was back on the question of backups. So it's kind of it's a question about Oracle. You see that, Michael? Do you want to take a stab?
Yeah, I do see that. So there have been no changes akin to sort of Oracle RMAN. I think we did add so one of the philosophies we have is Cockroach is being built as a cloud native database. And one of the things that is cloud native is the sort of cloud storage options, S3, Google Storage, Azure Blob Storage, right? And what's inherently built into those is bucket rules, and sort of bucket aging, right? So one of the things we did add in 22.1 is the ability to have write-only buckets. So one of the things that you can do is you can set your storage bucket to make it impossible to make the data within immutable for some period.
Yeah, object locked.
Yeah, object locks. Thank you. Fumbling through that one, and Chris comes to save me again. But what that does is it is a level of protection. It is definitely not an all-encompassing protection, but against ransomware, right? And because we're a lot natively writing to those sort of between scheduled backups and then between those object locks, but then also those bucket aging out rules. And also one of the things we added is AWS quality of service, such that you could say, send your full backups to a faster type of storage and your incremental backups to a lower grade, cheaper storage, right? These are all things that we're doing to make it easier for you to sort of configure and interact and operationally manage your costs of these backups. Our man has style things is on our radar, is on our roadmap, but doesn't currently have a timeline. I think the other side that if backup management, we are making improvements to backup management in the future. One of those, for example, is this notion of a named sink. So when I'm writing, so when you set up a backup today, you have to say, okay, backup to, and then S3:// some bucket I'm never going to remember, versus saying naming a bucket to be like primary backup location. You can then query in your database, what is this primary backup location? That's where my backups are, right? And so the idea is that making it easier for you to interact and manage and see where these things are in a cloud native way is sort of really the way we're going to it. In the long term, we definitely have sort of heard the feedback and I think understand the value of something more akin to Oracle's RMAN, but that's not on our short-term roadmap right now.
All right, thanks, Michael. So thank you, honestly, to both of you. Those were there was a lot of questions, and definitely appreciate your time. And thank you to everyone who participated. Thanks for all the questions. We will so for all the people who have asked questions, we will, we will enter all your names into a raffle and pick out 3 names. 3 of you will win that Scale is Always in Style t-shirt. And I'll follow up with those people who do win the raffle. So you'll get details from me on how to get your t-shirt. And like we mentioned in the chat, we will have a recording that we'll send out after after the session. And I did just get a message from Michael. Michael said there's one more question that you thought we could answer in the chat. Do you want to go for it?
I'll go for it. I
Okay.
think it's a pretty deep technical question. I'm not an engineer, but I think the one thing that in terms of logically how to think about this is that the intent is a way to manage the transaction. The data itself is committed in a separate construct from the intent itself. And so what happens is the intent itself is also stored on disks, subject to replication, et cetera. And so the intent itself will track, okay, say this query is open, it's still getting a write. What happens is when the data actually commits in the RAF log of the sort of the data range itself, it will then send it when it gets sort of the RAF ACK, that then goes back up the chain and tells the intent this is committed. The intent then changes its sort of status from pending to committed. And that's the way that you separate sort of the race or the clash between those two. The thing to note is that the intent itself is primarily just a transaction sort of tracking concurrency control mechanism, and the data itself and sort of the raft proposals and the raft commit and the raft sort of replication, the data itself is actually a separate process that really sits at a layer below this notion of sort of intents and transactions. And if you want to learn more, the architecture section of our documentation actually goes quite deep into these concepts as well.
Thank you for calling my attention to that question. I think you should get a t-shirt, Michael, and Chris, you too. See if we have any extras. All right, so like I was saying, we'll send out a recording after this. We'll send out some more links so how you can learn more about this release. And if you're not already using CockroachDB, serverless is probably the easiest way to get started. It's really fast. So give it a try. And thanks everyone for joining and participating. I think this was a great session.